Hello everyone, welcome back. We're trying something new. I'm not doing this live. The stuff that I cover is kind of dense, and I realize I'm not also good at recording for long periods of time, and I feel like for live streaming, live streamers go for like multiple hours, and I just feel that given the content and my own personal like abilities, that's just not like a thing that's going to happen, at least anytime soon. Sorry, my voice is a little rough. But I figured we can do this not live, and I'll just record this ahead of time, edit it up a little bit, and drop it, and you guys can enjoy it at your leisure. I am wearing the Philosopher King hat today. This is because I'm doing Wittgenstein again today. Let's go ahead and hop right in there. Let's see, hopefully OBS is behaving itself. Hopefully it's not blocking off too much of this. Alright, I think we left off here. Whether the word number is necessary in the ostensive definition depends on whether without it the other person takes the definition, otherwise then I wish. And that will depend on the circumstances under which it is given and on the person I give it to. And how he takes the definition is seen in the use that he makes of the word defined. Again, we only really know what people mean by words based on their behavior, I guess is kind of what it's getting at here. So one might say, the ostensive definition explains the use, the meaning of the word when the overall role of the word in a language is clear. Thus, if I know that someone means to explain a color word to me, the ostensive definition, that is called sapia, will help me to understand the word. And you can say this, so long as you do not forget that all sorts of problems attach to the words to know or to be clear. One has already to know or be able to do something in order to be capable of asking a thing's name. But what does one have to know? And there was an aside here. I think I am figuring out that they do put in these footnotes that are like disconnected from the rest of this. Could one define the word red by pointing to something that was not red? That would be as if one were supposed to explain the word modest to someone whose English was weak, and one pointed to an arrogant man and said, "That man is not modest." That it is ambiguous is no argument against such a method of definition. Any definition can be misunderstood. For what might well be asked, are we still to call this definition? For of course, even if it has the same practical consequences, the same effect on the learner, it plays a different part in the calculus from what we ordinarily call ostensive definition of the word read. And remember, ostensive definition is like definition by pointing something out in the world. When one shows someone the king in chess and says, "This is the king," this does not tell him the use of this piece, unless he already knows the rules of the game up to this last point, the shape of the king. You can imagine his having learnt the rules of the game without ever having been shown an actual piece. The shape of the chessman corresponds here to the sound or shape of a word. Let me go ahead and chew on that for a little bit. The shape of the chessman corresponds here to the sound or shape of a word. So the use of the chessman corresponds to the use of the word. And you could imagine knowing, the rules of language without knowing necessarily the word. Let's continue. I'll have to chew on that. One can also imagine someone's having learnt the game without ever understanding or formulating rules. He might have learnt quite simple board games first by watching, and have progressed to more and more complicated ones. He too might be given the explanation, "This is the king," if, for instance, he were being shown chessmen of a shape he was not used to. This explanation again only tells him the use of the piece, because, as we might say, the place for it was already prepared. Or even, we shall only say that it tells him the use if the place is already prepared. So you have to know you can be pointed out, this is a king, but that only really means anything to you if you know how kings behave in chess. You can be given a word, but you already have to have some notion of how that word is used in language, or at least you have to know the game. You have to understand the language game in order to understand the place of words in that language game. You have to understand what it means to give commands in order for you to understand how a word might be used to give commands. I think that's what he's getting at here. And in this case, it is so, not because the person to whom we give the explanation already knows rules, but because, in another sense, he is already a master of the game. Consider this further case. I am explaining chess to someone, and I begin by pointing to a chessman and saying, this is the king, it can move like this and so on. In this case, we shall say, the words, this is the king, or this is called the king, are a definition, only if the learner already knows what a piece in a game is. That is, if he had already played other games, or has watched other people played, and understood, and similar things. Further, only under these conditions will he be able to ask relevantly in the course of learning the game, what do you call this? That is, this piece in a game. Wonder how does this start? What's the, I suppose, just ostensive definitions in humans, I guess. We may say only someone who already knows how to do something with it can significantly ask a name. And we can imagine the person who is asked replying, settle the name yourself. And now the one who asked will have to manage everything for himself. Suppose we're getting at here that it doesn't really matter what the king is called so long as it behaves as a king is supposed to behave. You could call it a duke, and as long as it still did the king thing, then it wouldn't really matter. I think that's what he's getting at here. Someone coming into a strange country will sometimes learn the language of the inhabitants from ostensive definitions that they give him, and he will often have to guess the meaning of these definitions, and will guess sometimes right and sometimes wrong. And now I think we can say, Augustine describes the learning of human language as if the child came into a strange country and did not understand the language of the country. That is, as if it already had a language, only not this one. Or again, as if the child could already think, only not yet speak. And think would here mean something like talk to itself. And indeed, to what degree one can think if you don't have a language? I mean, you have to have a language to put your thoughts in, right? I mean, it's a really interesting question, what thought consists of in a non-linguistic sense. That's a really fascinating question. And if, after you've learned a language, can you even learn to do that again? Could you pull that off? Is another interesting question. Suppose, however, someone were to object, it is not true that you must already be master of a language in order to understand an ostensive definition. All you need, of course, is to know or guess what the person giving the explanation is pointing to. That is, whether, for example, the shape of the object, or to its color, or to its number, and so on. And what does pointing to the shape, pointing to the color consist in? Point to a piece of paper, and now point to its shape, now to its color, now to its number. That sounds queer. How did you do it? You will say that you meant a different thing each time you pointed. And if I ask how it is done, you will say you concentrated your attention on the color, the shape, etc. But I ask again, how is that done? Suppose someone looks to a vase and says, look at that marvelous blue, the shape isn't the point, or look at that marvelous shape, the color doesn't matter. Without doubt, you will do something different when you act upon those two invitations. But do you always do the same thing when you give direction, when you direct your attention to the color? Imagine various different cases to indicate a few. Is this blue the same as that blue over there? Do you see any difference? You are mixing paint and you say, it is hard to get blue of the sky. It's turning fine, you could already see blue sky again. Look what different effects these two blues have. Do you see that blue over here? There. Bring it here. This blue signal light means. What's this blue called? Is it indigo? You sometimes attend to the color by putting your hand up to keep the outline from view, or by not looking at the outline of the thing. sometimes by staring at the object and trying to remember where you saw that color before. You attend to the shape, sometimes by tracing it, sometimes by screwing up your eyes so as to not see the color clearly. I don't know what that means. I've read that sentence before. I don't know what superpowers Wittgenstein has that he can, like, squint his eyes so as to not see the color of something. I don't think that I can do that. And in many other ways. I want to say this is the sort of thing that happens while one directs one's attention to this or that. But it isn't these things by themselves that make us say someone is attending to the shape, the color, and so on. Just as a move in chess doesn't consist simply in moving a piece in such a way on the board, nor yet in one's thoughts and feelings as one makes the move, but in the circumstances that we call playing a game of chess, solving a chess problem, and so on. But suppose someone said, I always do the same thing when I attend to the shape. My eye follows the outline and I feel blank. And suppose this person to give someone else the ostensive definition, that is called a circle, pointing to a circular object and having all these experiences. Cannot his hearer still interpret the definition differently, even though he sees the other's eyes following the outline, even though he feels what the other feels? That is to say, this interpretation may also consist in how he makes use of the word and what he points to. For example, when told to point to a circle, for neither the expression to attend the definition in such a way, nor the expression to interpret the definition in such a way, stands for a process which accompanies the giving and hearing of the definition. There are, of course, what can be called characteristic experiences of pointing to, e.g. the shape. For example, following the outline with one's finger or with one's eyes as one points. But this does not happen in all cases in which I mean the shape, and no more does any one other characteristic process occur in all these cases. Besides, even if something of the sort did recur in all cases, it would still depend on the circumstances. That is, on what happened before and after the pointing, whether we should say, he pointed to the shape and not to the color. For the words to point to the shape, to mean the shape, and so on, are not used in the same way as these, to point to this book, not to that one, to point to the chair, not to the table, and so on. Only think how differently we learn the use of the words, to point to this thing. Only think how differently we learn the use of the words to point to this thing, to point to that thing, or on the other hand, to point to the color, not to the shape, to mean the color, and so on. To repeat, in certain cases, especially when one points to the shape or to the number, there are characteristic experiences and ways of pointing. Characteristic because they recur, not always, when shape or number are meant. But do you also know of an experience characteristic of pointing to a game in a piece in a game as a piece in a garnet all the same? I think that means supposed to be piece in a game. Characteristics of pointing to a piece in a game as a piece in a game. I think that makes more sense to me. I don't know why garnet's there. All the same, one can say, I mean that this piece is called the king, not this particular bit of wood I am pointing to, recognizing, wishing, remembering, etc. So, for example, by king we mean the shape and not necessarily this particular bit of wood, although you do kind of also mean this king, not just kings in general. And we do here what we do in a host of similar cases, because we cannot specify any one bodily action, which we call pointing to the shape, as opposed to example for the color. We say that a spiritual, mental, intellectual activity corresponds to the words. Where a language suggests a body and there is none, there we should like to say is a spirit. Interesting. What is the relation between name and thing named? Well, what is it? Look at the language game from example 2, or in another one. There you can see the sort of thing this relation consists in. This relation may also consist in, among other things, in the fact that hearing the name calls before our mind the picture of what is named. And it also consists, among other things, in the names being written on the thing named, or being pronounced when the thing is pointed at. But what, for example, is the word this, the name of in language game 8, or the word that in the ostensive definition, that is called. If you do not want to produce confusion, you will do best not to call these word names at all. Yet strange to say, the word this has been called the only genuine name, so that anything else we call a name was one only in an exact approximate sense. Not quite sure what he means by this has been called the only genuine name. That feels like a reference to something that I don't know. This queer conception springs from a tendency to sublime the logic of our language, as one might put it. The proper answer to it is, we call very different things names, and the word name is used to characterize many different kinds of a word related to one another in many different ways. But the kind of use that this has is not among them. And I think we have a footnote here, or an aside. What is it to mean the words, that is blue, at one time as a statement about the object one is pointing to, at another as an expression of the word blue? So, for example, you point to a wall and you want to say the wall is blue. So you say, that is blue, meaning the wall is blue. But what if you wanted to define blue to someone? You point to a blue wall and you say, that is blue, meaning that is what the color blue means, I think is what we're getting at here. Well, in the second case, one really means that is called blue. Then can at one time mean the word is as is called and the word blue as blue. And another time we mean is really as is. It is also possible for someone to get an explanation of the words out of what was intended as a piece of information. Marginal note. Here lurks a crucial superstition. I don't know what that means. It is also possible for someone to get an explanation of the words out of what is intended as a piece of information. It is also possible for someone to get an explanation of the words out of what it was intended as a piece of information. I'm going to have to chew on that. Marginal note, here looks a crucial superstition. Can I say boo 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 and mean, if it doesn't rain, I shall go for a walk? It is only in a language that I can mean something by something. This shows clearly that the grammar of to mean is not like that of the expression to imagine and the like. Okay, where are we at? Does this not actually not tell me how long we've been going for? Oh, we've been going for about 19 minutes, so we can go a bit farther. It is quite true that, in giving an ostensive definition, for instance, we often point to the object named and say the name. And similarly, in giving an ostensive definition, for instance, we say the word this while pointing to a thing. And also, the word this and a name often occupy the same position in a sentence. But it is precisely characteristic of a name that is defined by means of the demonstrative expression, that is n, or that is called n. But do we also give the definitions, that is called this, or this is called this? This is connected with the conception of naming, so as to speak, an occult process. Naming appears as a queer connection of a word with an object. And you really get such a queer connection when the philosopher tries to bring out the relation between a name and thing by staring at an object in front of him and repeating a name, or even the word this innumerable times. For philosophical problems arise when language goes on holiday. And here we may indeed fancy naming to be some remarkable act of mind, as if it were a baptism of an object. And we can also say that the word this to the object as if it were to address the object as this, a queer use of the word, which doubtless only occurs in doing philosophy. But why does it occur to one to want to make precisely this word into a name when it evidently is not a name? That is just the reason. For one is tempted to make an objection against what is ordinarily called a name. It can be put like this: a name ought really to signify a simple. And for this, one might perhaps give the following reasons. The word Excalibur, say, is a proper name in the ordinary sense. The sword Excalibur consists of parts combined in a particular way. If they are combined differently, Excalibur does not exist. But it is clear that the sentence, Excalibur has a sharp blade, makes sense whether Excalibur is still whole or broken up. But if Excalibur is the name of an object, this object no longer exists when Excalibur is broken in pieces, as no object would then correspond to the name, it would have no meaning. But the sentence, Excalibur has a sharp blade, would contain a word that has no meaning, and hence the sentence would be nonsense. But it does make sense, so there must always be something corresponding to the words of which it consists. So basically, even if you took Excalibur apart, at that moment you could say Excalibur doesn't exist anymore, and yet it still kind of makes sense to say that Excalibur has a sharp blade, but Excalibur doesn't exist, so how does that sentence work? I think is what we're getting at here. So the word Excalibur must disappear when the sense is analyzed and its place to be taken by words which name simples. It will be reasonable to call these words the real names. Let us first discuss this point of the argument, that a word has no meaning if nothing corresponds to it. It is important to note that the word meaning is being used illicitly if it is used to signify that the thing corresponds to the word. That is to confound the meaning of a name with the bearer of the name. When Mr. N dies, one says that the bearer of the name dies, not that the meaning dies. And it would be nonsensical to say that, for if the name ceased to have meaning, it would make no sense to say Mr. N is dead. Okay, that makes sense. Even if Excalibur is destroyed, the theoretical meaning of what it would mean for Excalibur to exist, the name still signifies that. Although, as we said before, it doesn't really mean or signify so much as we have to sort of ask how the word is used in our language games. Okay, I'm going to call it there for right now. I think that's enough. I'm realizing I'm going to need, let's see, if we can get through at least 2 pages per session, I think is what we're going to need to aim for, because if we only do a page a session, we're going to have 129 episodes of this, and that's going to be far too long. So we're going to see about, and maybe we can even get up to 3 pages per session. The problem is Wittgenstein is dense, and I'm worried that, well, you know what, I'm not even going to say I'm worried for my audience. I'm worried for my sake. My brain tends to shut down after a page or two, to be perfectly honest with you. So this will be slow going, but we'll keep at it. I hope you enjoyed reading along with me today. If you wouldn't mind giving the channel a subscribe and the video a like, I would super appreciate that. Thank you so very, very much. Good day.